Well, thank you all for coming. It's a pleasure today to have you here, and especially a pleasure to welcome François Heisbourg to the IISS-US. I could spend a good part of our time this afternoon talking about François' background. I would just mention a few things. He has had a distinguished career of service in the French Republic, including in the Foreign and Defense Ministry, very senior advising in diplomatic positions. He's been a thought leader over many decades on the, I don't want to say many decades, but several decades.
Too many.
A long time, and author of many distinguished pieces on strategy, war, conflict, defense policy, you name it. He has been, again, many affiliations, but I mention here just a few. Special advisor to the Foundation for Strategic Research in Paris, chairman of the Foundation Council of the Geneva Center for Security Policy, and of course he had a distinguished term as director of the International Institute for Strategic Studies, and presently serves since 2001 as chairman of the IISS Council. The title of his talk today is the Prospective Collapse of the Euro. The floor is yours. I look forward to your presentation.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you very much indeed. Thank you for having come here. A Frenchman is always surprised when people accept to show up at meetings which take place over the sacred moment of lunchtime. But then, this is all for the good, I guess. The prospective collapse of the euro. When I was thinking about the topic, I was reminded of the old Irish joke. I don't know whether Irish jokes are permitted in the month of St. Patrick, but well, anyway, there's this a couple of tourists from Britain who are hopelessly lost with their car in the middle of nowhere, somewhere in, I guess, County Limerick or a place like that. And all of a sudden they see a peasant and a farmer. They ask the farmer, how do we get from here to Dublin? And the farmer answers, well, if I were you, I wouldn't start from here. And it's pretty much the same with the euro. I'm not sure that one would want to start from where we are, but the fact is that we are where we are, and that we do have to try to arrive at what is an acceptable destination. Now, first of all, what I'm not going to do, and then what I'm going to do. What I'm not going to do, I'm not going to announce the inevitability of the disappearance of the euro. The operative word is prospective. It's not inevitable. It's quite possible, but it's not inevitable. Nor the immediate possibility of a demise of the euro. A very short-term demise, even with an enormous amount of bad luck, lack of wisdom, and insufficient efforts, appears to be, by this stage, to be singularly less likely than it may have been a few months ago. What I am going to do is, first of all, assess some of the decisions or absence of decisions which could indeed lead to either the end of the euro or to the rescue of the euro. And I immediately show my cards by saying that an enormous amount of effort, an even greater amount of wisdom, and an enormous amount of luck is going to be required if we are going to save the euro. Obviously, come back to that. And secondly, I will examine the strategic consequences of both of these outcomes, failure or rescue, because the hypothesis of a rescue of the euro carries strategic consequences which are very substantial and which tend to be forgotten because there's the sort of general assumption that if we rescue the euro, it will be because Europe will not have tremendously changed. we're going to have to change Europe tremendously if we're going to save the euro. And that has strategic consequences. So, first of all, the euro's problems and possible solutions or lack thereof. First of all, the most obvious flaw, and it's a real flaw, but it's also the one which everybody can see for himself, and indeed many have seen from the beginning, that this was the creation of a currency with the creation of a central bank, but without a federal government to run monetary and economic policy. That was the original flaw, and in effect, we find ourselves pretty much like a horse in the middle of a ford, having left the bank of the national decision-making processes for the national currencies on one hand, and being very far away from a federal European bank. With that most obvious flaw came, and I speak in the past tense here because things actually have changed here. And second, at least to some extent, there's a second order flaw which went along with that obvious flaw, and that is that although we created our central bank, that central bank, first of all, had and continues to have a narrow mandate, unlike the Fed. The Fed worries about inflation, but it also worries about jobs. The sole mandate of the European Central Bank is to worry about inflation. That can be a problem. But it's also a central bank which was deemed to be independent, but which in practice was supposed to have been like a European version of the Bundesbank in its glory days. Now, conceiving of the ECB as a bank which is a clone of a national bank does not make that bank independent of that model, on the contrary. And one of the really interesting things which happened over the last 2 months is that with Mario Draghi, the ECB has probably become, for the first time, a truly independent central bank. That is, it runs itself as a European central bank, not as a clone of the Bundesbank. And the Declaration of Independence was the establishment of that mechanism known as the LTRO, which in effect saved the European banking system, prevented the European equivalent of Lehman Brothers. It's only now becoming apparent in the outside world how close we came to the brink of that disaster. In Germany and in France in particular. I'm not talking about Greek banks here, I'm talking about German banks and French banks. Most of this flaw and its second order derivative, I can put it that way. Then we have a falsely obvious flaw. This one has been pointed out by all sorts of people, but it's actually, it's not entirely clear that this flaw is what it appears to be. And that is that the euro is supposed to have allowed free riding by fiscally improvident governments. That certainly occurred in the case of Greece. But I note that a couple of the most deeply affected countries by the crisis of the euro, that is Ireland and Spain, were actually amongst the very few states of the Eurozone which were fiscally not only entirely responsible, but actually exceeded the targets, the mandatory targets of the so-called Stability Pact. Stability Pact established 15 years ago, limiting budget deficits by member states, and the absolutely capping the debt at the level of 60% of GDP. Normally, that Stability Pact should have been enough to prevent free riding by fiscally improvident governments. If it did not serve its role, it's because Germany and France in 2003, 2004, decided that the Stability Pact was not to be respected. And we, in effect, destroyed that tool which allowed the euro not to have been created with that flaw. And the responsibility is essentially German. I would also add that although we may pretend nowadays to discover that Greece, absolutely hopeless country in terms of its tax raising, in terms of its hiring and firing policies, etc. Well, we all knew 10 years ago what we were doing when we let Greece into the Eurozone. To pretend that this was an ex post facto discovery is wrong. So if we allowed fiscally improvident countries to come in, we did so with a fairly clear knowledge who they were, and furthermore, we had ourselves destroyed the firewall which would have prevented them from contaminating the system. There is, in addition, and this brings me to the future, a deep and not so obvious flaw, and it is the one which Martin Wolf, I think, has the best pointed out, and that is that the euro embraced and continues to embrace vastly different economies, as different as Alaska is from Alabama. Well, you can have economies which are as different as those of Alaska and Alabama if you have a federal government and everything that comes along with having a federal government. We do not have one. Now, the possible solutions. How do we cope with these design flaws? And you will note en passant that if you look at recent initiatives taken by our governments collectively and the European institutions, that these design flaws have not been corrected at this moment. We have stopped the fever of last autumn. We're no longer running a 104-degree fever, but the disease is there. It's still. I close parentheses. Now, the possible solutions. What happens now? Well, put it in very cryptic terms, 3 scenarios. One is we hive out. Second one is we break up. And the third one is we blend in. Let me get into each one of these. To hive out, well, that is removing Greece from the Eurozone. This would have personally been my preferred solution 2 years ago. Treat it like the IMF treats Latin American or Asian countries which have problems similar to those encountered by Greece. That is a big structural adjustment program, a sharp devaluation, and a big haircut followed by Brady bonds or similar instruments. With Greece remaining in the Eurozone, of course, the devaluation component is not possible, and the haircut aspect was just barely feasible. It took us the better part of 3 years to finally get there. It could still happen, the removal of Greece from the Eurozone, not because of immediate economic requirements. The situation is no longer a crisis situation in economic terms. The haircut is now in process. Bailout is occurring. It will establish some form of economic continuity in Greece for a period of months to a very small number of years before we get to the next episode of crisis. But of course, the Greek population may well run out of patience. When the Greeks are told if you leave the Eurozone, it is an absolute catastrophe for Greece, which happens to be entirely true, they have some trouble of comparing, of distinguishing between that statement and their actual situation, which is over a 4-year period, a minus 20% recession. Minus 20%. By the end of this year, at the current rate, Greece's GDP will have dropped by 20%, and with 4 full years of recession. Comparison which comes to mind here is the US in the Great Depression, minus 25%, or Germany in the Great Depression, minus 25%. So how much worse can it actually get, whether you stay in the euro or whether you leave the euro? Not entirely clear. And that is the conclusion at which the Greek electorate may eventually arrive. We'll see. So hiving out may be possible. Could the euro cope with the hiving out of Greece? Maybe. There is a fair amount of firepower now in place with what is left of this financial stability fund, and more importantly, the European Stability Mechanism. And this is, the banks have now taken their losses on this. And the markets may just be able to consider that Greece is really a case apart, maybe. Hiving out, breaking up. Breaking up, how does the euro break up? Assuming that Greece's leaving the euro would not cause the breakup. Well, several things would have to happen. First of all, the European Central Bank would not be able to extend further its functional equivalent of quantitative easing, which is the LTRO mechanism. It's not the same mechanism as the quantitative easing, but it has a similar effect. The second round of LTRO is now in progress. There are political limits to what it can do. They happen to be called, in one word, Germany. Whether Draghi can continue into another round is highly doubtful. That's the first condition for breakup. The second condition for breakup, the ESF and the ESM are not fully combined. It looks like we're getting into that situation. And their firepower will not be enhanced by the gradual establishment of Eurobonds. Whether those Eurobonds have a limited scope, what some people call project bonds. Now, project bonds may, by the way, will happen. I'll get back to them in a second. You'll forgive me for not going into them now. But in the breakup scenario, project bonds remain very limited, and the bigger thing, that is Euro bonds, do not happen. Germany continues to refuse. Third condition, and this is really a damned if you do, damned if you don't condition. Either the current fiscal pact is ratified, and implemented. That's the more unlikely part. And actually implemented. And if it is actually implemented, the current shallow, incipient recession in the Eurozone will broaden and deepen and lengthen. Just look at the language of the treaty and think for a moment of what would be the economic effects of actual implementation. You're not asked folks in the rating agencies, etc., what they think about the pact. They say, oh, it's not going to happen in any case, so we don't factor in its potential recessive effects. But if you actually take it seriously, you have a big, big problem. The alternative scenario, the more likely one, is one in which the treaty is not actually ratified. François Hollande has already indicated that he would not accept the treaty in its current form, that is, if it is not accompanied by serious stimulative measures, notably, I would guess, in the form of project bonds. Once again, I'll come back to that. The Spanish, the Irish have said they need a referendum. That's good news. And the third thing, of course, is our Spanish friends. Mr. Rajoy, very, very rational. And what I'm going to say about Spain is no element of critique. I think he's actually doing the right thing in terms of the substance. In terms of the manner, that's another question. But in effect, what Mr. Rajoy discovered, having come to power, is that public accounts in 2011 were even worse than had been expected. And yet he is stuck with a 2012 budget commitment, which can only be fulfilled, therefore, by making an even greater effort than had previously been planned, but against the backdrop of a recession which is already postulated to reduce Spain's GDP by somewhere between 2 and 2.5% this year. And that, of course, if he makes this greater effort, the recession will become deeper, and therefore the deficit will increase since the tax intake is going to be even weaker than had been done. In effect, a Spanish-sized version of the Greek death spiral when it began 3 years ago. So Mr. Rajoy is essentially telling Brussels, sorry guys, I won't be able to do it in 2012. I will fulfill the commitments for 2013. Brussels, for the moment, has been reacting in a relatively moderate manner, which is actually the best thing one could expect. It could be worse. But still, on the one hand, if you implement the treaty, you have a big problem. And if you don't have a treaty, then the markets are going to say, wait a second, these guys can't get their act together. And then get back into the days of 2011 when the markets were questioning the future of the euro. That, until now, I've been on aspects which depend on our policies. The wrong efforts, lack of wisdom, you name it. Now I get to the bad luck part. This also requires some bad luck. And here two stick out. One, of course, is the slowing down of growth in China. I don't know whether Wen Jiaobao's forecast for 7.5% is going to actually happen. The Chinese have been in the habit of stating low forecasts for execution and ending up with higher levels of actual execution of their GDP. But if it is 7.5%, that means a drop of Chinese GDP from its trend of the last few years by about 2 percentage points. Now, if you're Germany and your first trade customer is China, which it is from this year on. France is no longer Germany's first customer. China is. Reduction of Chinese demand is very bad news. It would not be good luck. The other element of bad luck would depend on American politics, and that is that you would manage in this country to work yourself in a situation where sequestration would actually be implemented. You've seen the forecasts of what happens to the American economy if sequestration is implemented. There we would have a perfect phenomenon of what physicists call resonance between the European recession on the one hand and the American slowdown on the other, the two mutually reinforcing their pro-cyclical propensities. Assuming that all of these things happen, then the fate of the euro is preordained. A country, saying that immediate crisis is behind us. It is behind us. But if you look at a country like Italy, which is doing all the right things, Monti, fantastic, really doing the right thing. The markets have given him a sort of break. He only needs 5% to pay 5% interest. But 5% interest, when your economy is doing minus 1%, and when inflation is doing, let's say, plus 1%, that means nominal growth is equal to about 0. And you have to pay 5% interest. How long is that sort of situation going to last? The markets will give the answer. I don't know what the answer is. But the answer is not an indefinite period of time. The answer is presumably a fairly short period of time. If all the things I described happen, and if countries like Italy, which are doing all the right things, find themselves in the situation in which they are, then the patience of the markets will be short. And the situation in 2013 would become rapidly very fraught. Blending in. Well, here the euro is rescued. How do we rescue the euro? Well, the fiscal pact, the new treaty, is either renegotiated or complemented by a growth component. The growth component itself would include what I call project bonds. Now, what are project bonds? This is the European Investment Bank, quite an important establishment, being authorized to raise money on the markets with the backing of the member states and the European institutions to fund growth-oriented public expenditure, infrastructure, R&D, that sort of stuff. That's what it's called, project bonds. It has to be a little bit like the what we called in France a year and a half ago, the Grand Emprunt, $40 billion we raised on the markets in order to fund not the state budget, but in order to fund specific R&D and education commitments. Project bonds and Euro bonds, at least for that part of the European countries' sovereign debts, which are above the 60% of the GDP level. There will be ferocious resistance in Germany to certainly the second thing happening. Strong resistance to the first one, but ferocious resistance to the second one. It certainly couldn't happen before the German elections. Could it happen after the German elections? Depends on who wins. If one listens to the guys from the SPD, socialists in Germany, chances look reasonably good that it could happen. So you need that to happen. And secondly, you need some good luck. Good luck in the States, that is, your current rate of growth is sustained, that having 3/4 of relatively good unemployment figures like you had this year and last year and the previous year, every time you had the disappointment. But this time you're not disappointed. Growth is sustained, unemployment goes down progressively, and by the end of the year, sequestration does not apply, and the man in the US helps nurture growth in Europe. And in China, the Chinese, as usual, manage their economic affairs magnificently, and growth and demand for European produce continues to expand. However, this does not solve all of the design flaws I mentioned earlier on. You would still, in the fullness of time, have to move towards a transfer union. That is, the ability for the federal state, because there would have to be a federal state, to dispose of a sufficient tax base in order to iron out the differences which exist between economies which are as different as Alabama is from Alaska, or vice versa. And I deliberately take the American case because it's actually quite difficult to find economies which are more different than the two I've just mentioned. And of course, doing a transfer union not only is anathema in Germany, but it's certainly not the air du temps, the flavor of the month or of the year or of the decade in Europe today. You look at the French electorate. French electorate was a very interesting opinion poll last week, unprecedented actually, which said the following. There were essentially two questions which were posed. Are you in favor of Europe having more powers in order to be able to deal with the crisis, even if this means a reduction in national power? One question. The other question is, are you in favor of increasing national power in order to deal with the crisis, even if this comes at the expense of European power? a large majority opted for the second solution. Very interesting. You look at the state of the debate in the Netherlands, pretty much the same. By the way, those two countries voted no on the referendum in 2005, which would have led to a degree of federalization. So the long-term prospects of remedying the basic design flaw of the euro, that is the disconnect between the project and the way it is going to be governed. And I don't use the word governance, which the French use all the time, because it's a weasel word. I'm talking about government, not governance. If we don't eliminate that design flaw, at the end of the day, the euro would not be sustainable. Now, strategic implications. First of all, the easiest one. What happens if the euro disappears, breaks up? Well, first of all, there is what looks like political consensus. If you look at the statements by Sarkozy, by Merkel, by Van Rompuy, that if the euro disappears, the European Union may well disappear too. That proposition is possibly true, but not necessarily true. It is to some extent a device to dramatize this, to give people a sense of what is at stake in saving the euro. But still, if the euro were to break up, it would be as a result of a combination of lack of wisdom, lack of effort, national egotism of such a magnitude that it would be sort of strange if all of a sudden, on the basis of those dysfunctional modes of conduct, that then all of a sudden we'll say, yeah, then we have to save the single market, and we have to save the borderless Europe without borders, we have to save the acquis communautaire, the European set of rules and regulations. So those politicians who made that forecast may, well, once again, be right. But still, I have a sort of nagging doubt that the acquis communautaire is so pervasive in so many fields. I mean, more than half of the legislation in the member countries of the EU, without exception, is a product of the Brussels institutions, not the national institutions. And undoing that, unraveling that, would be hellishly, would require a form of genius. Negative, perverse genius, but genius nonetheless. And since we haven't displayed enormous genius until now, I suspect that it may not happen. So the worst case of a complete disappearance of the EU, there's a question mark. But still, the big things, there's a single market and Europe without borders. These are the two big things which were designed in the late 80s and which were implemented during the 90s. Those two things would actually probably go. And there, Merkel, Sarkozy, Rompuy are probably right. What would this lead to? Well, here we have a bit of a paradox. Because some people, including Sarkozy, in one of his recent speeches, he talked about the return to the wars of the past, etc. We saw this also in some of the Polish statements. Radek Sikorski's magnificent speech in Berlin, or the Polish Minister of Finance last September. No, this would not lead to world war. World wars were a product of hegemonic aspirations, not of debilitated, economically declining, poorly performing states. The world wars were the product of energy and dynamism. And imagining a repeat under conditions so extraordinarily different is actually quite difficult. But maybe we could have a repeat of the Balkans wars. Maybe, but here again I have my doubts. Because maybe the single market would disappear. Maybe Schengen would disappear. Certainly if I look at President Sarkozy's campaign speech last Sunday, he certainly didn't indicate any inclination in coming to the Schengen Treaty. But even if those things disappear, if you're a country like Serbia, or like Bosnia, you'd still want to get into the European Union. You'd still want to get in, because it would still give you access to markets and to goods, to services, which they do not have that access to today. So repeating the Balkans wars is not a foregone conclusion either. What we could get, though, however, is not a direct consequence in strategic terms of the sort that I've just mentioned, World War, Balkans wars, etc. No, we would have an indirect consequence, which is that the breakup of the Eurozone would indeed lead to economic depression. Rise of populism all over the place. We already have a fair amount of that. Seriously bad, seriously nasty. And when I use the word depression, I use the word depression as it was used in the 1930s. That would certainly not be good for peace and stability in Europe. But once one has said that, one has not said that the end of the euro would necessarily lead to sharp differentiations in strategic terms within the European Union space. And for a very simple reason, is that all of the stuff that I've just talked about would affect everybody in a very similar manner. Certainly all of the countries of the Eurozone would be similarly affected, and the others would be affected by ricochet. So the paradox is that the breakup of the Eurozone does not actually introduce, mechanically at least, new differences between the Europeans. It simply, if I can put heavy quotation marks, precautionary quotation marks around the word simply, it would simply create an economic disaster with dire political consequences, and a Europe which would be the most pathetic of partners for the United States of America and the NATO framework. Now, more interesting part is what happens if we rescue the euro? What are the strategic consequences in that case? Well, here, the economic part, the indirect part, is much more benign. It's much more benign because my assumption, and I think it would have appeared in everything that I've said until now, is that we're not going to rescue the euro if we don't introduce an element of stimulus and growth into Europe's economic decisions. The Americans did so at the time of the Lehman Brothers crash, and I think it was a wise decision for the Americans to put the emphasis on quantitative easing, etc., early on. You saved your automobile industry, and the fruits may be slow in coming, but they taste a lot less bitter than our current fruits of recession. So we save the euro because we will have, in the short to medium term, because there will have been an element of stimulus. So the depression, which I referred to earlier on, does not happen in this scenario. Conversely, what we do have is deep differentiation between the European countries. This process of differentiation has already begun. It began in the night of the 8th of the 9th of December in Brussels, when the British decided to go off on their own tangent vis-à-vis the fiscal pact. A very important move, which leaves the British in a potentially tricky situation, because part of Britain's strategic value was not simply, as it sees for itself, was not simply its special relationship with the United States bilaterally. It was also the fact that the United Kingdom, being part of the European Union, was also a bridge in the Atlantic Alliance between the United States and continental Europe. That was the Tony Blair in the pre-Iraq days. That was the Tony Blair extraordinary performance, where he managed to be in the forefront both of NATO reform and of the launching of the European security and defense policy. I would add it was a very wise strategy, which I think served Britain extremely well, and would have continued to serve extremely well if other events had not intruded like Iraq. In the rescue scenario, Britain finds herself casting off progressively the various moorings which link her to the European Union. Does she leave the European Union entirely or not? Question mark. If you put the people in a referendum in the United Kingdom, I suspect the answer would be yes, let's leave. But we don't know that, and I don't think anybody is actually in a hurry to do a referendum. So it may be a soft, gradual, progressive process. But still, it leaves Britain in a much less desirable strategic situation, more akin to that of Australia vis-à-vis East Asia. That is, a good ally of the United States, but not by virtue of being a big player in East Asia. An Australia without the sun, without the kangaroos, without the clouds. Not a great prospect. First impact. Second impact, in the east and in the southeast of Europe, we would have a sharp division between those countries which would have both an incentive and the willpower and the ability to join the euro, and I think here in particular of Poland, which at least for the last 6 months and possibly earlier, has always looked at the crisis of the euro as a strategic issue, not simply as an economic issue. And the Poles are absolutely right. You have to look at this as a strategic issue. Sikorsky's speech was a strategic speech. It was not a macroeconomic speech. Ditto the finance minister's speech a few weeks earlier, which was barely noticed outside of Poland, but which certainly drew people's attention back home in Poland when he talked about the risk of the return to the darker parts of Poland's history. Poland being thrown back to its in-between situation between Russia and Germany, between Russia and the West. Poland, Latvia, Lithuania would probably make it. But what happens to Bulgaria? What happens to Romania? What happens to the Balkan states? There, the strategic consequences could be very serious indeed, because they're not going to make it into the euro anytime soon. They would not have the ability. I suspect they would probably not even have the will to try to make it into a federalizing Europe. Because don't forget, all of this assumes that the Eurozone is federalizing as it goes, looking more and more like India, Brazil, or the United States than looking like an assembly of nation states. And how one handles those countries of the periphery, whether they're actual members of the current members of the European Union or whether they are prospective members of the European Union in the Balkans, I don't have an answer to that, but it's certainly something which would have to be worked out pretty hard. In conclusion, America's role in all this. What can you guys do? Two things. One, which is entirely in your gift, but you will take your decision for your own good reasons, and that is, please, no sequestration. And I'm gonna quote Leon Panetta. I put the question to him in Munich the other day, asking the effects for him of sequestration, and his immediate answer was, sequestration is crazy. And he developed that idea a little bit, and I will spare you that, but I agree with him. Secondly, and this is much more an interactive process between the Americans and the Europeans, no shift to a hubs and spokes system. While either of these scenarios happen, or the ones which could fall in between, because, well, I've spoken in scenario terms, we all know, at least those of us who've been in this business for some time, we all know that what actually happens is never an exact scenario. So always something else or variation thereof. But as this goes on, individual European countries may be tempted to play bilaterally with the states And the US finding itself facing a deeply divided Europe may also be tempted to play with Peter and Paul and not with John and Jack. No, while all of this is going on, the NATO framework, the Atlantic Alliance framework, should be nurtured by all concerned. I know it's easier to say that than to actually do it, but it is something which is eminently doable. But it can only be done if we actually acknowledge that there is a risk that bilateralization could take hold. There have been signs of that in recent months, of bilateralism. They have been handled, I think, fairly well. I'm thinking about the notably the Polish-American connection. But it could rapidly become much more. Well, I've spoken a bit too long, but I think we have some time for interaction.
Thank you. Okay, well, the floor is open. If you get my attention, and then I will call on you and state your name and affiliation if you would. Jonathan?
Yes, Jonathan Pollack from Brooklyn. So, Jonathan, thank you. Good to see you. Thank you very, very much. I think I am reminded to some extent of what Herman Kahn and his splendid scenarios for growth in literature used to say, well, barring bad luck and bad management, that's where we would get in whatever year you might designate. If I could put you on the spot, however, it seems to me that if you have more optimistic possibilities here among the spectrum you gave us, they're contingent on a lot of moving parts. So my conclusion, and please correct me if you think I'm wrong, is that you are not particularly optimistic about the rescue of the euro. I mean, if you had to make a prediction, if you will, recognizing all the variables that are at play here, recognizing you're dealing with markets, you're dealing with popular opinion, and you're dealing with politicians, and those three alone are a kind of complex mix. What would be your expectation? And if, by the way, one other point about Chinese growth, it is true that the Chinese consistently lowball. I mean, it happens, although that's not to place absolute credence in the data that we are given when it comes out. However, I would note that the trend since 2007 has been to declining growth. And that is posing a set of fundamental questions for China. This is more, of course, their export orientation, as opposed to whether or not they would allow the kind of enhanced access that the United States and clearly others, notably Germany, clearly seek into the Chinese market. So anyhow, my thoughts.
Let's go direct. Yeah, I'll go direct. First of all, pessimism versus optimism. We are only going to save the euro if we acknowledge that the risk to the euro is existential and it's structural. If we do not acknowledge that, then the euro is sure to fail. We have a breather. Draghi has taken a fantastic decision, really smart. I mean, none of my banker friends had thought of that one. It's actually quite funny. You know, I sit for my sins on the monetary committee of the French Employers Union. Why? Don't ask me. It just happens to be that way. And I find myself with the bankers and the analysts and so on. And literally none of them had thought of what Draghi came up with. That was an incredible rabbit taken from the magician's hat. We have that breather. The things which I indicated are intrinsically very difficult to do. And they can only be done if there is constant pressure. And the problem is that as soon as you get a breather, the pressure to act disappears. So in effect, my pessimism is a constructive pessimism. And I mean that. I mean, I don't think we're going to do anything positive if we simply say, well, okay, we haven't had a debacle in the world market since last November. There is no immediate danger on the euro. The Greek issue is no longer causing septicemia in the whole system. We're doing fine. Let's now relax. Well, we can't relax. On China, no, I agree with your assessment of Chinese statistics, but I simply assume that the flaws of the present are no greater than the flaws of the past. And that therefore, all other things being equal.
I think on that we can move on.
And secondly, of course, the rate at which the reduction in the growth happens is crucial. Because of course, if China's economy has grown by 1/3 between the moment when it moves from 10% to 7%, if you're a German exporter, the net result is identical. The real question is whether this change of growth rate is going to be a fairly abrupt one.
Rich?
Elbridge Colby, CNA. Dr. Heisbourg, thank you very much for the presentation. I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit why a sort of kind of halt in the middle won't work over the long term. Perhaps I misunderstood you, but my impression was, even though you're pessimistic about the future and federalization for a variety of reasons, you also thought that a stop would lead to dissolution of some kind. I think I heard you say that Schengen would fall apart and the common market would probably deteriorate. And especially given what you said about the Alabama versus Alaska comparison, I read somewhere recently that the amount of labor mobility in the United States is something like an order of magnitude greater than it is in Europe. It strikes me that it's the obstacles to that federalization are tremendously profound. I was at a conference in Europe a few months ago, and people were talking in this very blasé way about, we need a civil war or something to create a federal system. I thought, it was an unpleasant experience, recent unpleasantness, but especially in Alabama. But I was just wondering, why isn't it possible that you would have a reduced Eurozone, for instance, without Greece and maybe one or two others or whatever it might be, and maintain the common market and maintain Schengen and maintain whatever federal laws are appropriate, but have that sort of mixed sovereignty model. I know as a Frenchman, and maybe Baudin, you wouldn't appreciate it, but I was wondering if you could comment on that.
I'd be happy to do that. We're still looking for a convenient site for Fort Sumter. No, seriously. You put your finger at one particularly sensitive spot, and you're absolutely right, and that's labor mobility. One of the things which distinguishes federations like Brazil, India, and the US from Europe is the mobility of labor. Now, mobility of labor in the US is particularly great for linguistic reasons first. You really you have one language and a half, if I can put it that way. And that makes things a lot easier. And secondly, it's also part of your historical development. But of course, a country like India has linguistic problems that you don't have, that Europe has, and yet mobility in India, in those areas which are part of the modern economy, as I understand, is actually quite important. I referred to Sarkozy's speech last Sunday. Well, it was a campaign speech, and one shouldn't make too much of it. But it was very interesting. He said, because of runaway immigration, France will ask for renegotiation of the Schengen Treaty. Now, the Schengen Treaty is the treaty which essentially makes Europe an internally borderless country in terms of the movement of people. That's the human accompaniment of the single market for goods and services. If you start rebuilding borders, which is in essence what Sarkozy appeared to be suggesting, then how are you going to create a semi-federal or federal Europe, even if it's only a rump Europe? Because France is Germany can't really do it all on its own. First thing. Second thing, I could perfectly well accept the notion that a country like Greece leaving the euro would be manageable. But I don't think it could go much beyond, because those countries which would be liable to leave are actually core countries, like Italy, like Spain, even France. State of our finances in France is not all that great. And last fall, we saw that the markets were starting to circle around us as well as the Italians. Well, we managed to push the wolves back in the woods with the LTRO. The wolves are still out there. First thing. Second thing. Imagine that you would have a rump Eurozone. Finland, Germany, Benelux, with or without France. Let's assume France is in there. The exchange rate of that currency would be phenomenally high because it would be driven by Germany, by the state of the German economy. And the problem is that the German economy is not like the French economy or like much of the Benelux economies. Could Germany live with a much higher value euro? Maybe. Could France live with a much higher value euro? No. The short answer is no, it couldn't. Historically, France has not been a strong currency country, except for about 5 years, between 1929 and 1935. That was the worst monetary policy we ever had. We were the last people to return to the gold exchange standard, and we were the last people to get out of the gold exchange standard. And guess who was the last? Which was the last country to build its economy back up to pre-1929 levels? It was France. The Germans, Japanese, despite the war, Americans, Brits, everybody got there before us. France is historically not a strong currency country. Our economy is not built the same.
So you actually need the weaker economies. It's an interesting perverse, because you usually
No,
hear
it's
about the
not
Germans needing.
No, our comparative advantage is not producing machine tools.
No, I'm just saying you need that to depress the currency in a sense.
To put it in a nutshell, that is not our comparative advantage. We're very good at luxury goods. We're very good at agricultural goods. We're very good at aerospace. Some of these things are more or less price sensitive. Some are less so. But overall, our economic structure is much more value of currency sensitive than is the case for Germany. Or if I take another country with a very strong currency and that same historical tradition, that's Switzerland. Countries have the political economy that they have, to use a 19th century term. The guys in the 19th century didn't always have it wrong in terms of their methods of analysis. I think we have gotten our analysis wrong by assuming that all of our economies were identical. They're not all identical, and you make up for the lack of identity through what? Through transfer union and through labor mobility, which is why I particularly appreciate the fact you raised the labor mobility point.
Yeah. Please. No, Rachel.
Thank you. I don't have much time. I'm Angela Blash from the French Embassy. And I wanted to make a few points. And thank you for your remarks, first of all. I'd like to stress a few points about the success story of the euro, and that must not be forgotten. Euro is a very young currency. It was created in 1999, was there at Brussels at that time, and when it was created, everybody was, many people, especially in this country, in the United States, were predicting a very dark future, even the future at all, was for the currency. Since then, from that date, what have we seen? We've seen a wonderful monetary stability. The euro was above $1 something for $1 something for €1. It's now above $1.30, even with the prices and the ups and downs. What have we seen? We've seen also wonderful price stability. The inflation has been less than 2%. We've seen a wonderful trade fostering. We've seen also some the employment, whereas in the same time the United States were creating 8 million jobs Europe was creating 14 million jobs. I mean, this must not be forgotten. We are now in the middle, we have the crisis that you mentioned. It is not that much a crisis of the euro than a crisis of the eurozone, which has been triggered not only by the deficit and debt crisis, public and private, that we know, but also by the world economic crisis. So what are we doing now? I mean, we are addressing the challenges that you mentioned, but we know these challenges. These challenges are, first of all, debt and deficit. Some tough measures have been taken. You could say it took too long to take these measures. It might have taken a long time, but it's not easy. But these measures have been taken, very difficult measures. Growth and employment have been also addressed, because we know that without these issues being broached, there is no optimistic future. So this has been also tackled, and European leaders are very well aware of this. We are addressing deficit and debt. We are addressing the convergence issue, because in the economic and monetary union, the M was more important than the E. Now we are addressing the E, the economic union, and convergence is very important. France and Germany, for example, but not only France and Germany, all the countries of the Eurozone are sort of getting together and have organized very regular meetings to sort of making decisions together. This is very important, making decisions together on the fiscal policy, on the budgets. Decisions have been taken too. On the economy, many important topics have already been addressed, and difficult decisions have been taken. But now everybody is aware of that, and everybody is moving. It's not only that because there is some pressure for the time being, as you said. The pressure will still be there in 1 year, in 2 years, in 3 years. And we have also this single market, which is very important to all of us. There is no way we can go backwards. And so we are the third challenge we are addressing is the reforms, structural reforms, very profound, deep, important reforms that all these Eurozone countries, but also European countries, are addressing for the time being. Thank you.
Just a few quick reactions. I very much would like to have the same level of faith as you do in the efficiency of all of our meetings. But I would certainly not begrudge the fact that we do hold many meetings, and that some actually do produce on occasion good results. First of all, on the record of the euro, the United States added 8 million jobs with a population of 300 million. We added 14 million jobs with a population of 500 million. That's nice, it's good. We had a very similar decade. GDP per capita, I say per capita, grew at the same rate in the European Union and in the Eurozone during the noughties as it did in the United States. It grew in absolute terms more in the US because the population grew in the US where it did not in Europe. So yes, the euro brought us the monetary stability internally, which made it much easier for the single market to develop. And that is absolutely true. There is a very remarkable speech which you may consult on the WTO website by Pascal Lamy on the effect of the euro, the existence of the euro for European and the single market, of course, the two things going together for the countries of the Eurozone, in allowing those companies, the European companies, to build up their productive base at a global level, thanks to the enormous European market. 2/3 of European trade takes place within the EU area, and 50% of Eurozone trade takes place within the Eurozone area. These are levels of integration which are higher than those of NAFTA or of Mercosur. All of this is true, but during those quiet years, when money was extraordinarily cheap, when Chinese laborers were saving money, which allowed us all to run casino economies, in the United States in particular, but also in parts of Europe, we replaced monetary instability with the building up of imbalances. And what happened during the crisis was the revelation of those imbalances. Private money imbalances in Ireland and in Spain, public money imbalances in Greece and Portugal and the like. Yes, it was nice not to have monetary instability, and it's still nice not to have monetary instability, at least when I move as a person from one country to another, although in practical terms, if you're the state of Portugal, you actually don't have the same currency as the state of France, because Portugal has to borrow at 12%, and we borrow at 2.5%, 3%. It makes a hell of a difference. And that's a difference which exists since the crisis began. Now, as for the current situation, we have been taking pro-cyclical measures recently. And we now have situations which are literally insupportable. You have 50% youth unemployment in Greece. You have 40% youth unemployment in Spain. In Spain, a well-managed country with a public debt which is lower than that of France. Lower than that of France. Debt and deficit are a big problem, as they are in the States. And Jean-Claude Trichet, when he was running the European Central Bank, used to have this spiel, and he was correct in having it, by the way, where he said the overall imbalances of the euro area are not as bad as the overall balances of the United States of America. The Eurozone public debt is lower as a proportion of GDP than that of the United States of America. The overall budget deficit of the Eurozone is less than the overall budget deficit of the government of the United States of America. All this is absolutely correct, but you won't be in a situation to reimburse your debt if you shrink your economy. See, it's a very basic thing. In the case of Greece, we tried for 3 years to do that. When we shrunk the economy by 20%, and we eventually finally arrived at the common sense solution that in the case of Greece, the only way to reduce the debt was actually to do a haircut on the bankers. Very severe haircut. No, we're not out of the woods. I wish we were. And I think we can get out of the woods. But it's going to take a lot more effort and a lot more wisdom and a lot more growth than we've had until now.
I think we can do one more question,
Yep.
Francois, please.
Andrew Pierre from Global Insights. Francois, up until your last comment, I was going to commend you for putting these complex economic issues in really a strategic context, and very appropriate for IISS, I think. Last question about some more of the technicalities we hear a lot about in this town. I would like you to take your vast knowledge of defense, NATO, and so on, and draw the implications of the economic situation, the complexities for the future of European defense forces, European defense spending, NATO. You mentioned the need for nurturing NATO, but there are new strains developing of NATO as a consequence of what you've been talking about, how that relates to Chicago, and more importantly, perhaps, how that relates to Afghanistan in terms of the long-term commitment 2014 or beyond, or any other activities outside of Europe, get into Syria if you wish to, but basically, I think you understand what is the consequences of this for the old issues of François and IISS, and I should add, anything you have to say on the policies of Mr. Hollande would be particularly interesting. Thank you.
Yeah, let me begin with the last one first, with Hollande. If he is elected, which is not a foregone conclusion by any means, the election would take place on the 6th of May. It would then take another week or so to proclaim the official results, and then he would designate Prime Minister, would actually operate on an interim basis since we have legislative elections in June. And the government would therefore be functioning, let's say, around May 15th. Chicago is on May 20th. The Americans are in the process of wrapping up the discussions on anti-ballistic missiles for Chicago, and expect the French to sign on the dotted line on 20th of May, without having had the opportunity to do an interagency review of any substance. Now, I happen to be reasonably sympathetic to the agreement which is being prepared on ABM for Chicago. I'm not a great fan of ABM, and I won't get into that now, but still the agreement, as an analyst, if Hollande were to ask me, do you think I should sign this? I would answer that the problems created by signing it are not as important as the problems you would create by not signing it. But still, it's a hell of a thing to ask of a new president within 5 days of having had the beginning of the possibility of starting to explore the issue to actually come to a conclusion. So that in itself may be a big problem. Second point, Afghanistan is now entering into its closing phase. How long and how disorderly that closing phase will be, I don't know. I suspect it's becoming messier by the second. I haven't seen any television footage from Afghanistan for the last 3.5 hours. I don't think that any of it will have improved in the interval, not since the guy went on a shooting spree, catch PTSD in Iraq, and you do a rampage in Afghanistan. It's a marvelous summary of what the last decade has done to us. Afghanistan is creating extraordinary distortions in NATO defense policy. We are becoming very good on counterinsurgency. If we, the French, had to refight the war in Algeria, we would be perfectly trained now to do so. But is this wise? Is it wise for Latvia to be expending its military energies on finding how to fight a counterinsurgency in Afghanistan rather than actually dealing with its defense priorities? We have been focusing on force projection and counterinsurgency. This is something which we should shake out of, particularly in an age, and this brings me to the more fundamental issue, and that is America is doing its strategic pivot vis-a-vis East Asia, and quite rightly so. No quarrel with that. It is doing so on the basis of defense spending, which is either stabilizing or shrinking, depending on whether or not you're going to have sequestration or something in between current trends and what may follow. And if you hive out social veterans and civil liabilities which are incurred by the US defense budget, overall you're going to have in any case a more limited defense budget in which to implement your new strategy. It would be interesting, by the way, for the IISS to do a stripped down analysis of America's defense spending, removing the veterans and other social security liabilities from the defense budget over a 10-year period. And then I saw the work we've been doing on the overall American defense spend as currently planned, which is not nearly as drastic as many people tend to portray it on both sides of the water, by the way. But if you do strip out those liabilities, I suspect it wouldn't look nearly as good as our macro analysis does. That's an IISS aside. The US focusing on East Asia, trying to keep out of trouble in the Middle East. Whether that will prove possible or not, I don't know. But in any case, de-emphasizing its presence in Europe, and indeed avoiding to get into new wars of choice. And that leads to the policy which has been styled leading from behind, with which, by the way, I have no particular quarrel, but which does pose problems of defense planning for the NATO European countries, setting aside the question of the evolution of our own defense spending. There are American assets which we will no longer be able to count on as an automatic amendment, as we were able to do so, or we thought we were able to do so, before the Libyan war taught us otherwise. Close air support in particular is something which the Europeans had essentially not been doing since the late 50s, because the Americans were going to do it. This was part of NATO planning. Now we may have to do it. In Libya, we certainly were not able to count on the Americans for that particular mission. Once again, this is not a critique, just that things are different. And that means that we're going to have some form of new compact within NATO as to what we can expect of each other. Now, the mechanical impact of the economic crisis in its latest manifestation on defense spending in Europe. We had managed to maintain Greek defense spending at unworldly high levels for much too long. Much too long. Why did we do this? Why weren't we harsher on the Greeks? Because they were buying all of their kit from the Americans, the Germans, the French, and the Brits. We have some share in Greeks' irresponsible fiscal profligacy, including in the field of defense. Germany, Britain, Italy, Spain, defense spending is not going to go up. And in most cases, it's going to go down. Germany may be just possibly a happy exception to the pattern. But to do what with its military kit, its military resources? Libyan experience also poses a few questions as to what Germany's defense forces are actually for when you have a UN Security Council resolution. In France, good news, bad news. Good news, President Sarkozy has no intention of reducing the defense budget beyond the very limited reductions which have taken place over the last 2 years. They're very limited indeed. They're, by the way, a lot less than what we say in the military balance, because we forgot to count in exceptional receipts. I'll have to write about that. It's probably my fault. I could be looking at this more carefully. François Hollande, here again, good news. He gave a big defense speech last Sunday. I don't know whether it's been translated to English or not, but it's on the web. The French version is. And what he says in budget terms is that the defense budget is not going to evolve differently from the overall evolution of state spending. That is, if state spending goes down, defense will go down proportionally. If state spending goes up, defense goes up proportionally. A proportionality rule, I would add, had a little bit to do with that decision. I'm very happy about that. If we had applied that rule, by the way, for the last 15 years, the defense budget would be practically exactly the same today, which is another way. The model works backwards, so I assume it will also work forward. That's the good news. The bad news is that if the Eurozone continues to slide into recession, if the recession is deepened because of our lack of wisdom and or lack of wisdom in the US, and bad luck and lack of wisdom in China, then the sorts of commitments I've just talked about, I don't think they'll actually hold. Then we get into a big problem. But finally, I would want to end on a happier note in the field of defense. Because if you listen to me too much, you may have the impression that I'm doing doom and gloom in a very systematic manner. In the field of defense, I'm actually a long-term optimist. The stuff which gives its efficiency to defense spending nowadays is essentially about the gathering, the processing, and the exploitation of information. The basic cost of a unit of information, however defined, the basic trend is Moore's law. A doubling of capacity at unchanged cost every 18 months. That eventually feeds even into the most hidebound military procurement systems. Oh, it's very difficult. It takes a lot of time, but eventually it gets there. If you have political decisions on top, like those we took in the framework of the defense white paper in France 4 years ago, you can speed up that process. Now, what that means in practical terms is that even a medium-sized country can actually look, or even a small-sized country, can look at having a broad spectrum of defense capabilities, provided it focuses its efforts on, to put it in very schematic terms, on Moore's law items more than on Augustine's law items. Augustine's law is the law according to which the cost of a weapon system doubles at every change of generation. He applied this when he was head of procurement at the Pentagon in the early 80s, and over a 30-year period, his law has turned out to be entirely accurate, exactly like Moore's law, but the other way around. The number of shooters is going to come down by virtue of Augustine's law. The efficiency of the shooters is going to increase proportionally even more thanks to Moore's law. That makes me an essential optimist in the field of defense. And in NATO, we should not talk ourselves into misbegotten, ultra niche, if I can use that neologism, role specialization within NATO, where the Czechs would do CW detection, where the Slovaks would do military engineering, where the Danes would do submarines, that sort of stuff, because of course countries can no longer have broad spectrum capabilities. We should not talk ourselves into those kinds of salami slicing, because if we do that, we are sure to lose any support from the taxpayers of our countries. How do you get the taxpayer to support 1/99th of a broad spectrum defense capability? You tell him that he's supposed to spend X amount of money on CW and nothing else. This is politically an extraordinarily bad road to go down. I know that a number of countries and people in the NATO bureaucracy are tempted to advocate that road, but no, it is a politically dangerous one, and more importantly, in actual terms, in defense terms, it's a needless road, because technological trends and cost trends tell us a very different story, one in which a country like Israel can have at any one given moment in time more spy satellites in orbit than Germany or France. And we make a big effort in France, by the way, in this field. Israel spends 1/5 of the money that we do on defense in France in absolute terms. They have more space capability in space than we do. Why is that? Because they don't think that shooters are important? Of course not. They think that shooters are bloody important. Given the place where they live, they need them more than we do. And yet, when they do their arbitrage, they go for Moore's law more than they go for Augustine's law. It's more important to have a handful of F-15s which know how to destroy that reactor in Syria than to have 150 F-15s doing that mission in the old-fashioned way. Cost-wise and in political terms, the results are not at all the same. And the Israeli case, as others, proves that you can actually have that kind of broad-spectrum capability at a fraction of some of the costs that we're consenting in European NATO countries today.
Francois, let me just say in summary, I think you've raised the bar here in Washington, discussion of the strategic implications of the prospective collapse of the euro. The very best IISS tradition of looking at this link between economics and security. I dare say that's what I expected when we set the program, and I don't think any of us, I know I wasn't disappointed by your analysis today. Thank you so much for coming and sharing that.
Thank you, Andrew.